All right. If we were in America, I would say, good morning, everyone. How do you feel to be here? And then you would say, yeah. And I would say, I can't hear you. And then you would say, that's a British audience for you. That's what I'm more comfortable with. So, it's Friday. Happy Friday. I think I'm one of the first talks of the day. It's a bit of a heavy topic to start this early in the morning, but you can take it. So today I'm going to be talking about a slightly awkward topic, and I'll mention why in a minute. 10 advanced Lightning developer tips. So I'm the CTO of a company called Salesforce. We're an ISV that has built a travel and expense native application on Salesforce. So we enable you to book your travel and soon your accommodation and manage your expenses in some really cool ways directly on the Salesforce platform. And then because it's in Salesforce, you can tie all of that data, all of that expenditure data back to any other data that you have in Salesforce if you run projects or you run your sales or your marketing. So that for the first time in our industry, not just the Salesforce industry, but in the industry as a whole, you're able to calculate your ROI on that expenditure down to the penny. So that's a picture of me. So that's what I look like. I worked in the Salesforce ecosystem for, I think it's 11 years now, 10 or 11 years. I've worked for 2 ISVs, a few Salesforce customers, and I was the CTO of the biggest Salesforce consultancy in Europe before it was acquired by Accenture. If you want to tweet me, I'll be sharing my slides afterwards on Twitter, and that's my Twitter handle. All right, now we get to the awkward part. Before I continue, as you may have noticed in the past week, Salesforce has made the Aura repository on GitHub read-only. This sends a pretty clear message with regards to Lightning components that are built upon the Aura framework. The reason it makes my talk awkward is because I submitted the abstract several months ago, and now I'm wondering how relevant it is to those of you that are learning about the future of Salesforce technology. So I don't think Lightning components are going anywhere soon, but there definitely is going to be a migration path set out in the near future that means that you will need to start learning Lightning Web Components as soon as possible because there is a new king in town. Sorry, the clicker is a little slow. So I had to pivot the talk slightly. I decided on this a few days ago. So now, instead, the abstract is 10 Aura component tips. Lightning components, by the way, are now called Aura components. More on that a bit later. 10 Aura component tips that are mostly compatible with Lightning Web Components. Number one, probably, well, what I think is probably the most boring tip for most of the people in the room is RTFM. Read the ducking manual. As someone who has not only been a developer, but an architect and run businesses, I think understanding the history and value of the programming paradigm that you are working in is key. So Salesforce obviously originally was, we would build applications using Visualforce and Apex. This was known as MVC. And I realized last night that I'm showing my age by talking about MVC and MVVM because I don't think anyone really talks about these the programming languages within these contexts anymore. So Visualforce and Apex, they were MVC, and anyone who's worked with them, I think you understand what the MVC concept means. I'm not going to go into it in detail. Whereas Aura is more of an MVVM model. It's a bit of a poor name because MVVM, model view model, approaches can also contain controllers, which obviously Aura does. And the reason that Salesforce decided to move away from Visualforce to Aura as a technology is that they wanted to have their users and developers benefit from the approaches and the usability benefits that you find within similar frameworks. So before Aura, you may have worked with frameworks such as Angular or React, and Aura Lightning components were trying to be something similar. The benefits here are that you have an incredible user experience. So if you're creating a single-page app, I don't know if many of you have heard of the concept of a single-page app, using JavaScript, the responsiveness of the application is particularly snappy. Almost all MVVM frameworks have this concept of components, so bits of application that can be reused throughout the application, so improving usability. But also, it creates a soft boundary between the different parts of your stack. Now, most Salesforce developers, I think we are full-stack developers in that we almost always code the front end as well as the back end of our solutions. But if you did want to split your team or split the responsibilities of a team for the purposes of developing a particular piece of code, you could have someone build the view model, which would be, in this case, your controllers, your component controllers, and your helpers, which are then fairly tightly bound to the view. And then whoever's coding the view can make certain assumptions about the structure of the data, whilst the data in the database can have a completely different structure that it doesn't necessarily need to be convenient to those developers working on the front end. Visualforce also was very much synchronous, not entirely, but it was mostly synchronous. You click a button, something happens. You could, of course, make asynchronous things happen if you wanted, whereas MVVM frameworks tend to be asynchronous, and they pass information about what a user is doing and the data in the system using events and event handlers, which anyone who's worked with Lightning will be more than familiar with. Quick question. How many of you have used Lightning components? Cool. How many of you have used Visualforce? A little bit more. OK, all right, cool. Lightning Web Components? OK, all right, cool. We need to work on that. All right, tip number 2. And this slide is meant to make you feel a little strange. Component nesting. As a developer, as a smart developer, and I know that all of you are, you probably enjoy engineering challenges. So you might look at a piece of application that you've built and think about, OK, this can be split into 47 different components, and then I can use those in various different ways, and I can nest them to different depths, and that's going to make me feel very smart. I am smart. It's going to make me feel very smart, and it's going to make my application really cool. And whilst all of these things are true, there are things that you should be aware of when it comes to nesting. You should limit the nesting of your components as much as possible, and this is a lesson that we learned at Sales Trip probably in the first few months. So reuse is great, and you should always aim for reuse as far as possible. But you will find that at some point, if you're nesting things too deeply, that you're going to do far more harm than good. So if one day you look at an area of code that you recently developed, and you think, what the hell's going on here? Why is everything so deeply nested? I don't understand this code anymore. That's probably a good sign that you've nested too deeply. The same applies if you're introducing new developers to your code base, and in areas where code is deeply nested, they have difficulty understanding, and if they do need to change their code, they easily make mistakes. What we found as well is that when you start nesting things very deeply, getting components to communicate with each other can be quite a challenge. So you start having to do very weird things in order for your application to continue to work. And finally, at certain points, the platform starts to crack. So weird things start happening. Things stop working. You start encountering odd errors that just don't make sense. And this is a pretty good signal that you've gone too far. So at Sales Trip, we always say drawimst. It just rolls off the tongue. This is my team, by the way, or some of my team. They've never heard me say that in their lives. So don't repeat yourself except when it makes sense to. So in the same way that when you model a Salesforce database, sometimes you need to duplicate pieces of information to benefit for various reasons. You might need to repeat yourself within your component. So I think, for example, there was an expense component that we created, and you'll see it pop up in pieces of code, that we had fairly deeply nested components. And eventually, we just lumped them all, took them out of their various components and lumped them mostly into a single component, which just made reading the code easy, changing the code easy. We repeated ourselves a little bit, but it wasn't the end of the world. Although I'd probably say the sweet spot is around 2 to 3 levels. I'm not going to show you any more crazy GIFs, I promise. Plug a linter into your IDE, or use a linter at all. Who doesn't know what a linter is? No one's going to admit that. So the concept of a linter is not a new one for other programming paradigms. A linter is just a tool that is able to scan your code against a set of rules where the rules are typically around the formatting of that code. Technologists tend to have very strong opinions about how code should look. And this can create mini flame wars within a team about things like tabs or spaces or where you put your curly braces. The idea here is that you predefine a set of rules that all code should follow. The linter then is able to run and check your code for conformance to those rules. And what's quite nice is that Salesforce has created something called the lightning linter, which you can invoke using the sfdx command. In certain IDEs, I only really use one IDE, but you should be able to create a macro that runs the linter every time you hit save. So anytime you save your code, it'll tell you, uh-oh, you've got console.log messages in there that you need to take out. And you can also get it to run in other places, not just locally. The rules can be customized to whatever your standard might be. And I was quite nicely surprised by the breadth of rules that you could execute with the linter. So if you're not using that at the moment, I highly recommend that you do. And certain IDEs, by the way, can also auto-format your code on save. So you can, if you can align your rules within your auto-formatting capabilities of your IDE and your linter, some of the job is already done for you.
So if you don't use DX, you can't use Lightning.
If you don't use Salesforce DX, I think you can, James?
I mean, you need to install DX CLI.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a DX project.
Yeah. Because I think the Lightning linter is just a fork of linters of ye old times. So for standard JavaScript, maybe with some modifications.
It's just ES.
Yeah. All right. I just spoke about flame wars, and now I'm at risk of starting one. Use an IDE that understands Lightning, and preferably DX, and preferably Lightning Web Components, because that is the new thing. So when I started developing a long time ago, I used Eclipse. It was an awful time for developers everywhere. And when Maven's Mate appeared, so that great tool invented by Joe Ferrero, I was happy to jump ship. I knew something about Salesforce development already, so I was okay working in Maven's Mate and some of the subsequent tools. However, when I started doing Lightning development, I was basically a beginner again and really needed all the help I could get. So James and I embarked on a quest to find the best IDE we possibly could, and we landed on Illuminated Cloud, which is a paid tool, and I know it hurts to pay for developer tools, but I really think it's worth the cost. It's not that much. Illuminated Cloud has a number of benefits, and I know that Visual Studio is the IDE that I think most people use. No? I see you shaking the head, Lynette. Illuminated Cloud. So Visual Studio has the benefit of being free. It is a really good IDE, but it feels as though Illuminated Cloud just keeps a little bit ahead of Visual Studio. It not only understands how to work with Salesforce DX, so the Salesforce DX obviously being the next generation of tooling and approaches for the Salesforce platform, but it understands Lightning. It's capable of auto-completing all of the things. So your objects and your classes and methods, fine, down to it creates a local version of a local symbol table of your org locally so that it's able to understand things like your objects, your object fields. It can even autocomplete those very, very long class names in Salesforce Lightning Design System. And you don't even have to type the letters in the right order. As long as you get the right combinations of letters in, it'll autocomplete those bloody things for you. So that's not even mentioning the capabilities that it has when refactoring code. So I'm getting a little excited here, as you can tell. So no matter which IDE you choose, make sure that it understands the technology you're working with, because it's going to give you a leg up. If it has autocomplete enabled, then it's going to help you look for commands or parts of the application without you having to reference documentation, although you should still reference the documentation. If possible, you still want that IDE to understand the old ways of working, so with your package.xml and the metadata API, because depending on your work context, you probably are going to have to fall back to the old techniques in some instances for a while, although I expect that will change over time. So whilst it might make you feel like an artisanal lumberjack to crank out code on Maven's Mate, I think that you're probably going to be a lot slower than someone who is using an IDE that is made specifically for the task at hand. How am I doing for time? Apex controllers versus Aura controllers. So in the old days, in the Apex days, you're probably fairly familiar with where business logic should go. You've got your page controllers, you've got the classes. If you correctly applied your separation of concerns, you've got abstracted business logic and other shared classes. But now, with Lightning, things have changed. And we have found, in general, so these aren't strict rules, but in general, your Apex code should be used for non-trivial integrations to third-party platforms, batch job logic, because how the hell else would you do it, any complex querying or DML, and that's just about it. One point that I don't have in here is that it can be a transport for data from the database through to your client-side code. The client-side code, however, now does the bulk of the heavy lifting in terms of business logic and application logic. So this is where all of your business rules and business logic should sit. Any basic querying and DML you can perform directly from the Aura components too. Any simple integrations, so I think at the moment in Sales Trip we've mostly used this for client-side integrations, for things that you want to display in the UI. Any utilities that you want to build, you want to stick into your Aura code. But you should not be putting all of this into your component controllers. I think that is probably something that most people do initially when they start with Lightning. And it's not the end of the world, but you do want to mature your approach as you learn the platform. So in terms of what goes into the Lightning component bundle, there are several files that you could work with, but you're probably going to work with just 3 most of the time. These will be the .cmp file. This is the markup file that obviously controls the way that your component looks and provides those actions that allow you to access logic that you've built. You have the client-side controller, and you want to keep this very light. In fact, this is probably, in most cases, it's just going to be a file that lists out a number of event handler declarations and then passes off the heavy lifting to another piece of code. And that other piece of code, in some instances, will be the helper. That's also in the component bundle. There are some limits to the way that helpers work. In general, you will want to put logic into the helper that is component specific. So instances of the helper class are shared across, one instance of the helper class is instantiated across all components of the same type in the page. So anything specific to that component, whether it's business logic or utilities, they'll go into the helper. But if you wanted to share business logic across different types of components, then you probably need to start looking at service classes. Who has used a service class? A service component. Okay, cool. I expected that to be quite rare. because when I first started using them, they were a bit of an awkward concept. Now I don't find them so awkward, but I'm not sure if that's just because I'm used to them. So a service component actually is just another component. It has all the elements that a component would usually have, although quite often you won't build anything for the view part. There usually won't be anything that you see when that component is used. Instead, you will bring that component into your other visual components, and it will have shared business logic. So for us, we've got a whole bunch of business logic around the way that we handle expenses. So whenever we have a component that deals with expenses, we would have an expense service component that is brought into the page and has brought into the component and has that shared logic in it. Or any other kinds of utilities that you feel you need to share across your components could be put into the service components. This is a key concept that everyone should learn, and it will feel weird when you start doing it initially, but I encourage you to. Learn to make promises. So promises are not a new concept in JavaScript, but I don't think that many Aura developers know much about them. You might have heard about them and been a little intimidated by them because there isn't a lot of documentation out there, although Bob Buzzard over there, I think, has some pretty good blogware that you could read. Aura components, Lightning components, surprise, they're JavaScript, mostly. And so you, as a Salesforce developer, should be as familiar with JavaScript and JavaScript standards as possible. The JavaScript language is very old. It has a lot of learning in it. It has a lot of convenience in it. So it is in your best interest to learn as much about it as possible. One thing about MVVM frameworks that I mentioned earlier and a lot of JavaScript is that there is a hell of a lot of asynchronous processing that happens. So you might have a single action that needs to occur, but it needs to do 5 things in the background, and those 5 things are interdependent and need to happen in a particular order. But they're all happening asynchronously, so how do you guarantee the order? How do you deal with errors? Now, usually, in the olden days, in JavaScript, you would use something called callbacks, and this means that you nest your different functions so that you have an outer function that calls an inner function, and when the inner function finishes, it gives the result back to the outer function. When you have 2 functions, this is fine. When you've got 5 functions, it starts hurting. When you've got 15 functions, oh God. And the error handling is awful. I bet that some of you are doing it in your Aura components today. Promises are a concept that was invented by the JavaScript community. Initially, they weren't a part of the JavaScript language. They were shipped as separate libraries that you could incorporate into your application, and you could use the concept of promises within your app. They were incorporated. They were so widely used that they were incorporated into the JavaScript standard quite a while back, actually. Now, what a promise is, the concept isn't that complicated, actually. It's a little bit of syntactic sugar to make it easier to read and understand asynchronous code and to control the order of the asynchronous code. I'm not going to go into depth about it because I would definitely run out of time. But effectively, it allows you to chain your asynchronous method function calls so that they happen in a particular order and that you deal with all of your errors at once instead of trying to figure out the interdependency between the errors and how to handle them. Beyond this, the JavaScript community and JavaScript standard has actually included something called async await, which is an evolution on top of promises. And again, this one I think is more syntactic sugar and less about functionality. Effectively, it allows you to write your asynchronous JavaScript code in a way that looks synchronous. Now, humans, despite being quite clever, we like things to happen in a linear fashion. We start getting very confused when things start happening in parallel, or when code that is written is running in parallel because it hurts our monkey brains. It is very nice if you're able to hand off this responsibility to the language. It'll just make your life easier, and you spend more time writing code than trying to figure out how to fix broken code. These are some very small examples. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through them, but on the top left, you can see these are 3 different approaches to the same piece of code. On the top left, you have the callback method of doing things, so nested callbacks. Handling errors is very awkward. The code is difficult to read. Changing the code is very error-prone. On the bottom left, you have promises, which is a bit neater. Instead, you're just able to chain those functions and deal with errors quite neatly. And then on the top right, you don't even know that the code is going to be asynchronous. You don't even deal with the order of execution very much in this part of the code. You simply call a function and pass it some parameters in the way that you used to. And all of these would work the same way. Unfortunately, async await is not available in Lightning components, Aura components. However, Lightning web components are able to work with the most recent standards within JavaScript. So I couldn't find any official documentation on this, but if the former is true, then you should be able to use async await in your Lightning web components. Use lax. Now, except for you, who's heard of lax? One. All right, cool. I expected that too. Lax is a very cool open source utility. It does a very specific thing, but it does that very specific thing very well. I think the guy that's written it, he probably has a history in JavaScript and the pains of JavaScript. Effectively, what lax does is it reduces the amount of boilerplate code that you need to write within your Lightning components. So on the bottom left, you will see the typical approach to call in an Apex controller method from a Lightning component. You'll probably recognize the boilerplate code quite well, because if you've written a Lightning component, you've written that boilerplate code hundreds of times. So you'll see that you need to do things like set the callback. You need to handle the different states in an if-else statement, which I don't feel is particularly neat. And the old famous enqueue action function is there at the bottom. Whereas with lax, you can create service components. We usually use them for our service components, which we include within our view components. And then instead, you'll see on the right that none of that boilerplate code exists. And lax also is compatible with promises, by the way. So instead, you're able to just chain a number of function calls in the order that you need them and deal with the errors in a more natural way. I don't like writing boilerplate code, and I feel that you can introduce errors unnecessarily, so I really like lax. I'll share the slide deck after the talk, by the way, and that link will give you access directly to the open source library on GitHub. Third-party libraries. Those of you that worked in the Visualforce world, I love the Visualforce world. It's probably because I'm a bit of an old-timer these days. One of the reasons that I loved it is it gave me a lot of freedom around JavaScript. I could include whatever the hell I wanted in my Visualforce pages in any number of ways and manipulate the page however I wanted. The move to Lightning changed that, and for good reasons. So building a JavaScript platform, they wanted to ensure that any JavaScript that you wrote wouldn't risk their customers in terms of security. So if you're using Lightning, you will find out very quickly that many, and maybe even all, hosted third-party libraries cannot be used. So dynamic Google Maps, nope. Stripe, nope. It's the third point down, but you will also find that anything that tries to change the DOM, any libraries that try to change the DOM just aren't going to work. You could try hack those hosted libraries, download them and upload them as static resources. I wouldn't advise that, because those libraries are probably built to work against very specific APIs. And when those third-party APIs change, your libraries are no longer going to work, and someone's going to scold you real bad. However, there are things that you can download, libraries that are meant to be downloaded and uploaded as third-party libraries that you might want to use. So we, for example, have used Moments and Full Calendar. You want to probably use as fewer libraries as possible and as simple libraries as possible, because you can't be sure how the Salesforce platform is going to change in the future. So you don't want to be building huge swaths of your application dependent on third-party libraries, and then Salesforce says, nah, you can't do that anymore, and you're going to have to rewrite all of that code. Aura also has a number of built-in really cool capabilities that you're going to want to use. So again, RTFM. So things like moments have a lot of convenience built into them, but there are date-time utilities already in the Aura language specification that are going to fulfill most of your needs. This is a bit of a weird one. It's kind of within the realm of let me Google that for you. If you've worked on Lightning for a while, you know that the language has changed a hell of a lot in the past few years. So if you are Googling for help, as every developer should be fairly often day to day, you will quite often find pieces of documentation that are either no longer valid at all, or they will advise you on a practice that is no longer best practice, or is just a poor practice. And this problem is going to be compounded further very soon, because you're going to be Googling for Lightning components, which are now called Aura components, which coexist with Lightning Web components. So you better get your Google foo up in the next month or so, because accessing the right documentation is going to be a challenge. My advice is, whenever you're looking for something, try to find the Salesforce equivalent. Even if there are holes in that documentation and you find a piece of community created content, try and marry up the two just to make sure that what you're looking at is a best practice and fairly recent. There's also a really cool Chrome extension that you can plug into Chrome. And it's great for directly accessing various types of documentation. And I believe it understands your context to some degree too when searching for help. All right, and finally, I lied about the GIF. I'm sorry about that. This is really the last one though. So we were all working happily away with Visualforce and Apex, and suddenly Salesforce said, "Nuh-uh, not anymore. Now you're going to be Lightning component developers." And I think the move was a good one. The UI that we have today, the access to components, the paradigm shift was necessary to keep up with the way that the world was going. And if you compare the Salesforce UI to just about any other enterprise software, it's pretty damn good. However, we got invited to a pilot, Salesforce got invited to a pilot, was late last year, maybe the last quarter last year, and they were talking about Lightning Web Components. Lightning Web Components? What are these? Are you telling us that Lightning components are going away? And after the shock, and after looking at the code and Lightning Web Components themselves, I was incredibly happy. Lightning components have some things in them that I find a little bit annoying, to tell the truth. There's some awkwardness in the framework, and you get used to it, and you can build fairly quickly with the framework anyway. But Lightning Web Components are built in such a way that they are far closer to the likes of Angular, for anyone that uses Angular, or React. And I feel that they are just, Lightning Web Components is an evolution, a good evolution of Aura components. Some of the other benefits are that it is based on an open standard. So it's not just Salesforce declaring this is the way it's going to work. There is a consortium of businesses that are saying this is the right way forward, and many brains are definitely better than one. It's almost entirely HTML and JavaScript. This means that it is very, very fast, although at the moment in reality some parts are a little bit slow. But in theory, it's very, very fast. I think it's obviously still early days, and there are some bugs kicking around in the framework, but I think the promise of a much better framework is there. It supports the latest JavaScript standards. I think I mentioned that earlier when talking about async await. It doesn't solely rely on events and handlers passing data around, which is one of my biggest bugbears with Lightning components. Having everything talk to each other indirectly can be very confusing. And all the things are transferable in theory. So because it's based on an open standard, it looks as though later on you'll be able to pull in components, web components from other platforms onto the Lightning platform, onto Lightning Web Components platform pretty easily. You may also be able to move things out. You can now hire JavaScript developers from other places into the Salesforce ecosystem, which is always a problem. There are always too few developers. And in theory, if you wanted a job doing non-Salesforce work, you could probably quite easily get a job doing JavaScript work in another sphere. Lightning Web Components are the future. Salesforce has made this very clear. Lightning components are going to continue to work. Aura components are going to continue to work for a while. It's going to take me a while to get used to saying Aura components. They're going to hang around. I don't think Salesforce will ever stop supporting them, but I think that they're probably going to focus all of their efforts on developing Lightning Web Components. So it's in your best interest too. And also, I just think it's a more fun framework to work with. So I do have a few more minutes. And because I didn't touch on Aura, advanced Aura topics very much, I thought I'd try and get out 2 very quick concepts. I might run out of time. Let's see how it goes. So the first of these is if you are building a highly bespoke user interface using Aura components on top of one of your objects. So for us, we have a very bespoke expense page. You will obviously build a number of components that need to go into that page that displays or allows create or edit on those particular records. We found quite early on that input fields within record edit forms have a lot of convenience. An input field understands the object field that you are giving to it and displays it appropriately, which is good, but you can't do much with the display beyond that. But if you have a set of input fields within a record edit form and you submit that in the submit handler, you will be given a JavaScript representation of that object and their fields in a way that's really familiar. So you're working indirectly with the database. And when you want to persist that data to the database, you don't need to pull the data apart and try and figure out how to ram it back into that particular object. So the convenience of dealing with the database is one that you probably want to keep. So you want your input fields within your record edit form. However, you will find, because you're building a custom UI, that you want to have a lot more control over the way those fields look. So you will probably start looking at inputs. And inputs have a lot more flexibility. They've got requiredness on them. There are lots of different types of inputs that display in a number of different ways. So you have more options. Now, I don't know if anyone has had to do this before, but what we found is that we would, in that particular instance, we have inputs and input fields on the same object field in the same record edit form. The first one is for display. The input is for the display so that you can customize it. The second one, the input field, is hidden, so the user never sees it, but it is given the data when the form is submitted, so that in the background, in the JavaScript controller, you then have the data in a way that's convenient for you to operate on the data and against the database. I'll try to do that very quickly, and it's probably a bit confusing, but we can talk about it afterwards if you have questions. And then number 2, if you're creating a Lightning component that you want to put into a record view page, so for example, if you want to see the difference between an opportunity amount and all of the expenses that are associated with that opportunity, you might create a component that says opportunity amount minus the roll-up of all expense amounts. Now, if in that standard record page you change the amount, you would want that component to update dynamically without a page refresh because you're working in a single page app. And the way that you would do this is that within that component that you include on the page, you would use the record data, so that this would understand when the record updates in the background, refresh the component that's on the page. Okay, so those are my 2 micro tips. All right, that's it. Two GIFs and 11 tips. Thank you very much for your time. Any questions? I think we have 60 seconds. No? Okay. You have one?
Yeah. With the last one, can you also list more than one record? Second list version? Because I was searching for
Yeah.
it.
I don't know. Are you talking about related lists?
Yeah.
No. There's no way to do it for related lists. Any others?
This Lightning Web component, is it ready to fully support your network?
I would experiment with it. because I don't think everyone knows. There are some limitations, but not all of the limitations are known. So, for example, within Sales Trip, we've picked a very simple piece of functionality that's not too complex, and we've started building that out just to test where the boundaries are so that we have a feel for it. It's not just about whether it can do what Lightning components can do, it's also about whether you can build as quickly as you can with Lightning components. So that would be my advice. It's a little bit of an unknown at the moment. Okay, is that time? Okay, thank you.
Capado separates user stories into individual feature branches in your code repository. This makes it easy to deploy code into multiple environments without having to worry about other developers' changes being introduced accidentally. Capado also automates the process of doing a pull request, making it easy to compare code from one environment to the other.
Earlier, with chain sets, adding metadata components used to take time. But with Capado, it has become easy and quick because it provides ability to search, filter by type, last modified by, created date, etc. Also, it has ability to integrate with Jira, Git, Bitbucket, making it powerful and providing traceability for our changes.
As a release manager at MassMutual, the great benefits I see are it helps us to bundle multiple user stories across the team and deploy in one go, which saves a lot of release time. But in chain sets, we have to deploy user stories individually. With chain sets, developer can skip an environments while deployment, but with Capado, we have a set deployment flow between the environment. Capado comes with a great reports and dashboard, which helps us to track an org level metadata changes.
When I joined MassMutual approximately a year ago, we had a team size of around 50. Now over the last year, we've increased probably about twofold, and we've gone over 100 people for this team. Bringing in Capado was one of our best decisions. Not only was it a scalable solution with delivery with high confidence, but it also introduces and integrates the QA piece, establishing a CI/CD pipeline that every company really wants in today's day. They have given us professional support, they have given us innovative solutions, they have really worked with us hand in hand closely to make it a success story for us.
What some people may not realize is that MassMutual has been on Salesforce now for many years. As we leaned into our digital transformation, this presented both a challenge and an automation. This presented both a challenge and an opportunity in terms of maturing our release management practice. I'm actually very pleased with both the features and the partnership Capado has offered. We've achieved a number of short-term wins, and I'm now more confident about our future ability to scale our DevOps practices here at MassMutual.